I'm Ryan Crocker, Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I'm going to start with just a few administrative announcements. There is such a thing as a free lunch, and there will be sandwiches outside when we break at noon. We are going to live stream this for any of you who don't stay through the whole thing. That's bush.tamu.edu/conference. I know there are some concerns about parking. It is true that any cars in lot 43 will be towed at 5:30 p.m., but we do have spaces in the fan field across the street, and you'll be just fine there. Today is the 11th of September, 14 years on. It's a day that none of us who were around will ever forget where we were, what we were doing. I remember a lot of things. I remember numbers. 11, 77, 93, 175. Those were the flight numbers of the 9/11 planes. I was on a U.S. Air shuttle to New York that morning. It was one of the last aircraft to land at LaGuardia after both towers were hit. When airports reopened, I was on about the first flight out of Dulles to go to Europe to talk to the Iranians about Afghanistan. A couple of months after that, I was in Afghanistan opening our embassy. I mention all this because it's a profound anniversary for America and for the world. And although it wasn't planned this way, it is very appropriate that we come together to discuss the topic of national security and women's insecurity. The proposition that women's rights are human rights, I think, is pretty well established. Today we'll be looking at another proposition, the link between women's security and national security. None of the 9/11 hijackers were women. Hijackers came from a movement that was sheltered in the Taliban's Afghanistan, by far the most repressive regime in the world concerning women's rights or even women's existence. We've got an extraordinary group of people here today to address these issues, those who have been in the fight for women in society for many years, both here and in Afghanistan. So we'll be looking at the state of the nation and the state of the world with respect to women and security. And of course, you get to security for women when women are involved in all aspects of society and of governance. So this will be a time 20 years after the landmark Beijing Women's Conference to kind of see how we're all doing with some of those targets. Beijing, among many other things, set a metric that 30% of all parliaments in the world should be female. So how are we all doing? Well, here in the U.S., House of Representatives is 19% female. Senate is 20%. The Afghan parliament, 14 years after 9/11, is 27% female. we in the U.S. had something to do with that, and we'll be talking about all of those things later. But we've done some positive things here at home. 3 of my last 4 bosses in the State Department are women. Secretaries Albright, Rice, and Clinton. And I can tell you, all 3 were really darn good. I have the privilege now to work for another pretty darn good woman, the Provost of Texas A&M University, Dr. Karan Watson. Dr. Watson.
Howdy. Those of you not from Texas A&M are just kind of wondering why any sane people would start any conversation with howdy. But it works here, so just hang with us. You'll find yourself saying, I would never do that, but if you hang around long enough, pretty soon that word will be coming out of your mouth and you won't know why. So it means welcome. It means we're ready to start. It means many, many things to us. But most of all, it means that we're really honored that you are here. And so we are truly honored that we have great speakers, that we have great colleagues who have said this is a topic that we need to engage in. And Texas A&M University might not be the first place people think of for this kind of conversation. But that might be because they don't know us very well. And if you knew us better, you would know that we are adamant about some core values. We are adamant about the idea of excellence and the point that you can't be excellent if you are excluding a substantial part of society from the conversation. We are adamant about integrity, that you can never give your integrity away. And what we know is that when everybody knows that, men and women, that you will not fail if you maintain your integrity. We are adamant about leadership and the fact that you don't have to have a title to be a leader, that you are a leader because you have character and you do what's right and you keep your values. We are adamant about loyalty and the fact that you have to stay committed to what you are loyal to. But we are also adamant about respect, and that we have to respect that all of us have differences in what we are going to lead in, be loyal to, even what we think we do best to show our integrity. But mostly, we are adamant about selfless service. And the Bush School is one of our true gems in talking about what it means in a society that we live in to demonstrate selfless service. They educate people, some of them young, some of them not so young, for public service, for service in foreign affairs, and more for nonprofit organization service. And we are adamant that that is one of the true missions of a great university and a land-grant university that's supposed to provide accessibility but supposed to give back all the time. And this conference is a great conference to talk about all of those values that we are adamant about, and also how do we help the United States and the world get even better as a society in all of those values. Now, a little bit about me. I am an electrical engineer, which I think is probably very common in the room. There's probably just a whole bunch of electrical engineers. And probably a whole bunch of female electrical engineers, since we're all the way at the undergraduate level in the nation to 15% of the people who study electrical engineering are women, which is vast different from when I started, and it was 1%. And I have the privilege of being one of those women who rides on the wave of other people who have put a great deal of effort into making sure that I had access and opportunity in a field that just 5 years before me they didn't have. And I've run into many, many people who would have been awesome engineers, but they're just a little bit older than I am and didn't have the same opportunities. I have the privilege that it had been pushed so much just before I was ready to go to college that when I was standing in line to become a teacher, and education alphabetically is next to engineering. So as education was trying to ask me, did I want to be a math or a science teacher, because that was my preferred fields, the engineering guy said, if you come to engineering, you don't have to choose, you can do both. And that's how I ended up in engineering, because the message had come through that they're supposed to not just wait for me to show up, they're supposed to come and help me get there. And they did. And yes, I have put up with some things that women have to put up when they're in a field where they're not sure if you really belong there. But I've also had many privileges. Every faculty member knew my name the first day. And I was one of those kids that liked to skip school a lot, so they knew I was gone as well. But it has served me well to be part of a society in a time for what my interests were when they were inviting and encouraging us. And yes, there were barriers. But I can see that the women just before me were not given those access privileges and were beat up. Not in some of the ways that y'all are going to be talking about, because we're talking sometimes about women who are murdered, who are treated ruthlessly and stuff like that, when they're just trying to help their families and themselves survive. And that's got to stop. So those of us who are privileged to be in the United States and still having to put up with barriers have to pay a lot more attention to we owe it to the rest of the world that we have to get all of society in all of the world recognizing. And I will tell you about engineering, that when they do serious studies, they find the profession is greatly advanced. For example, in Sweden, when they studied a design of a road system and park system, all of the all-male teams never noticed that there was an elementary school in the region. But every one of the female designers noticed that and modified their designs. When they have studied automobile and car designs that are all male teams versus those that have mixed teams of males and females, or the rare one that is all females, it is amazing the difference and the better sells for the car industry, because we all know women pick the vehicles. You can pretend the men do, but the women pick the vehicles, and they know that now. And so it's very important. And it's not because some men don't think about it. It's because when you have a team that is diverse and brings all those perspectives into play, you nearly always come out with a much better system. So you today are going to talk about something much more serious than designing cars or where we will put the roadways and playgrounds. We're talking about how people are going to be able to live their very lives and what it's going to take for the privileged nation of the United States to continue to provide even better leadership and how we help the world come to terms with this. So again, I am very excited that you are here. I am very excited that many of you would come for the very first time to College Station, because we know it's on the way to nowhere. And so we really do appreciate that you've come to take part in this conference. And we think it's going to be a great outcome, not just for those of us who attend today and learn from each other, but also for what we can create as a message to the next political leaders across the world as to how they may frame and think about issues. So welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Howdy. You can see this is going to be a theme. So I hope you're getting enthusiastic about all those howdies that we're saying. I'm Professor Valerie Hudson, and I have the honor of being a professor in the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Indeed, I hold the George H.W. Bush Chair, which is a great honor to me personally, because I feel that George H.W. Bush was one of the finest presidents that we've had. And so I am more than delighted to be here. I want to thank several people and institutions. I thank the Bush School and its leadership, particularly that of Dean Ryan Crocker, who has been instrumental in helping this conference come to pass. And without his tireless support, I don't know where we would be. I thank Texas A&M. I think you heard from our Provost what kind of support we've had at the institutional level for conferences like this. I'd also like to thank the Scowcroft Institute and the Mosbacher Institute for their support. We have had no roadblocks in putting forth this conference. Everyone has been so accommodating and willing and share the vision. It's a great place to be, and I'm grateful that you have the chance to come to College Station and learn more about us. Now, I must say, this is really a fantastic day in my life, and the reason is that what we have assembled here is what I would consider to be a dream team. And those of you who are staying for the duration of the conference, you are in for a treat. What we've assembled here are some of our nations and other nations as well, finest academic voices, activist voices, journalism voices, as well as policymaking voices on issues of women in foreign policy. Women's empowerment is a foreign policy issue, as well as women's involvement in foreign policy decision-making. And so with Dean Crocker, I'm very mindful that September is a month of noteworthy anniversaries. As he has already said, today is the 14th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, which thrust the United States into a global war on terror. This month is also the 20th anniversary of the UN Conference on Women in Beijing, China, where Hillary Clinton, one day to become US Secretary of State, asserted, as Dean Crocker has said, that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And girls and women all over the globe know that now in a way that perhaps we did not know it back in 1995. And this month is also the 15th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which obligated nations, didn't just ask pretty please, but obligated nations to include women in all peace negotiations and post-conflict reconstructions. So the last decade and a half or so has been a time of great change. Are these anniversaries related? I think they are. I don't think it was a coincidence that, that young men from nations where women do not enjoy the full spectrum of rights as embodied in the Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, where that is an issue. I don't think it was a coincidence at all. And as Donald Steinberg has said, this has become my favorite quote of the last year, and you can see that we invited him because we wanted to hear directly from him and not just his quotes. But take a look at that quote there. Compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require US troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women. And he's right. And what I'd like to do now in setting the stage is to explore that proposition in greater detail with you and sort of open, in a sense, the dialogue for the conference. That the security and the status of women impact the security and stability of their nations is not some brand new proposition. For example, way back in 2006, we had Kofi Annan, who was then UN Secretary of General of the United Nations, say, the world is starting to grasp that there is no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls. And I would venture that no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after a conflict has ended. Perhaps what was lacking in the past was a strong evidentiary basis for these assertions. But that time is over. What I hope to present in the first few opening minutes of this important conference is a broad survey of such findings, which I believe demonstrate across a wide variety of dimensions that what is happening with women strongly affects the trajectory of their nation states and even the international system. So let's take that tour, if you will, of these dimensions. Are you interested in food security? If you are, then you should be interested in women. Women produce most of the world's food. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, women perform 80% of agricultural labor and over 50% of such labor worldwide. But it is also true that worldwide women only own 2% of land, even though study after study has shown that children's caloric intake is highly correlated with women's property rights. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, calculates that if women farmers were given the same assistance as men in terms of land extension agents and training and so forth, malnutrition would drop 17% globally. Remuneration in cash crops, unfortunately, is usually only given to those who own the land, the men. This despite the fact that study after study has shown that over 90% of a woman's earnings go to her family, while only 40 to 60% of a man's earnings go to his family. We know that women are expected to process food, find fuel and potable water on top of all their other responsibilities for children and agricultural work. So in a sense, they have a triple commitment of time throughout the day. Women are often, however, expected to eat last or to eat food of poor quality. And this is shown in the fact that 2/3 of the malnourished children in the world are female children. In many agricultural societies, it is actually women who are responsible for seeing that women and children do not starve, and men in these cultures may find it deeply culturally shameful to help their wives, and so do not assist them, even though studies have shown that men who do assist their wives in these kinds of labors have significantly larger harvests than those that don't. So the question to ask is, might inequitable treatment of women make famine and malnutrition more likely for a nation state? And the answer is, I think, is well established. The answer is yes. We can also look at studies on economic prosperity. The World Bank did a series of very significant studies several years ago in which they took a variable that they called the gender gap. And so the larger the gender gap, the greater the disparity between the lives of men and women. The smaller the gender gap, the more equitable. So what they found was that the larger the gender gap within a society, the lower the GDP per capita of the nation. And this was highly significant, strongly significant. The larger the gender gap, the lower the rate of national economic growth. When you don't harness the talents and the energy of fully 1/2 of your population, you're simply not going to grow as fast as other nations. They also found that lower investment in female education was again strongly linked to lower national income. And last, USAID and other organizations have found, again over and over, that those development projects with a gender component are far more successful than those without. So again, we could raise the question, might inequitable treatment of women make poverty more likely for a nation state? And I think, again, we could argue yes. Health in women is a topic about which I think we know quite a bit now. And the status of women is strongly linked to national health outcomes. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the infant and child mortality rates, as well as the lower the level of child malnutrition. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the share of household income spent on cigarettes and alcohol, because women have more of a say in how the income is spent in the country, in the household. The larger the gender gap, the higher the AIDS rate, and the higher the overall burden of infectious diseases within the population. And lastly, the larger the gender gap, the lower the life expectancy, not just for women, but for men as well. And so, might inequitable treatment of women make disease and ill health more likely within a society? I think that's so. Let's go to my stomping ground, because I'm a specialist in security studies. And what we see here is some very interesting findings, some of which come from my own research. In our own studies, we have found that the higher the level of violence against women, the more likely a nation state is to be non-compliant with international norms and its own treaty obligations. The higher the level of violence against women, the worse a nation state's relations with its neighbors. Larger the gender gap, and this is the work of Mary Caprioli and others, the more likely a nation state is to be involved in internation and intranation conflict, and the more likely it is to use violence first in a conflict. The higher the level of violence against women, the less peacefully the nation state will behave in an overall sense in the international system. And some of my earlier work on abnormal sex ratios and the relation to security there, we showed that in case studies of India and China, that culling girls from the birth population through sex-selective abortion or postnatally through female infanticide creates a young adult male population that is 15% larger than the female population, fueling what we found is violent crime, general instability, and the potential for regional conflict. So a good question for us to pose is whether inequitable treatment of women makes conflict more likely. We could also look at the dimension of governance. And here I'm relying on some wonderful studies that have come out of the European Union, the Interparliamentary Union, and so forth. The larger the gender gap within a country, the higher the levels of perceived and actual government corruption. The smaller the gender gap, on the other hand, the greater the level of trust in government and the greater the transparency in government. And what researchers have found when they go down into the micro level and they look at what women are doing when they're in the legislature, they've discovered that when the representation of women in decision-making is higher, more attention, more lawmaking revolves around issues of social welfare, fighting corruption, and improving legal protection for citizens. And what we've also found, and these are some brand new studies that are hot off the press, when women are represented in peace negotiations after a conflict, participants are likely to be far more satisfied with the outcome, and what we've also found is that the agreement is significantly more durable. It will actually last longer if there is representation of women. So we might ask ourselves, might inequitable treatment of women make poor governance more likely? And of course, we can't overlook demographics. You really can't talk about demographics unless you're willing to talk about men and women. And yet sometimes we do talk about demographics as if women's agency were not part of this. Over and over again, we have found that when marriage is an institution that is conceived of as being hierarchical, where marriage is highly inequitable between men and women, unsustainably high levels of population growth often result, because a woman is really not in control of her body in such marriages. On the other hand, when society makes it economically irrational for women to have children by punishing mothers in the workplace, as we see in nations such as Japan, sub-replacement birth rates often result. Women are not stupid, right? If you're going to punish them for having children, they're not going to have children. And lastly, a word has to be said about the overall global sex ratio. The overall global sex ratio should be about 98 men per 100 women, because women tend to outlive men. They have a longer life expectancy. But what we find now in the 21st century is that that global overall sex ratio is now 101.4 men per 100 women. This is a stunning factoid, because what we're talking about here are literally tens of millions of missing women. Some demographers estimate almost 200 million missing women from the world. My colleague Andrea Denboer from the University of Kent at Canterbury and I have done a recent survey of childhood sex ratios around the globe. Back in 1995, when we were first conducting this research, there were only 5 nations that had abnormal childhood sex ratios. When we redid our study this year, in 2015, 20 years later, the total of nations is now 19. There are now 19 nations in which childhood sex ratios are significantly abnormal, indicating that sex-selective abortion is taking place. So this alteration from 98 to 100 up to 101.4 to 100, that's not the result of any sort of natural plague or natural disaster. This is a completely man-made alteration of the population of the entire world, and it's worth thinking about. And of course, with such an imbalance, especially as these are localized in some extremely high sex ratios in certain areas of the world, for example, we've found sex ratios where there's actually 2 to 1, 2 men per every woman in some specific locales in India and other countries. Marriage market obstructions often take place where men are unable to find marriage partners or form households, and this leads to a deep sense of grievance and instability as well. So we might ask ourselves, might inequitable treatment of women make demographic problems more likely? And I think there we can say absolutely, absolutely. So what we've come to know is that women aren't the canary in the coal mine. Oftentimes, this metaphor is used to suggest that where women are hurting, that's a sign that something dysfunctional has happened in the society. Well, yes, that's true, but I'd like to suggest that male-female relations within the society are the coal mine. And the canaries that are singing are poverty and malnutrition and ill health and explosive violence and poor governance and all of these other outcome measures that we see at the nation-state level. This is that conceptual difference wrought by seeing women, or as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton so dramatically put it in 2012, the subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country, which has come to have been known to be known as the Hillary Doctrine. Now, in my field of study, security studies, we often talk about this German term called Realpolitik, and otherwise known in American jargon as realism. The idea that the national security of a country is best secured by taking an unvarnished look at the realities of the security situation and dealing with them forthrightly. Well, if that's the case then, given the evidentiary base that we have, that means that seeing women is, in fact, a pillar of clear-eyed realpolitik. Whether we're examining the national interest in terms of durability of peace accords, food security, security demographics, national health, national wealth, quality of governance, interstate relations, or any other aspect of national security, women's empowerment helps in tangible ways. And I think the rest of the speakers of this conference are going to be testifying over and over to that fact, what they've seen on the ground, and what they've seen through their own lived experience. However, that's Women in Foreign Policy 101, okay? I'd like to suggest it's not that simple, as Patricia Lytle and I make plain in our new book, The Hillary Doctrine. And by the way, my publisher would like you to know that there's a book signing today at 5 o'clock. So. It's not simply a case that we can sprinkle in a few women and stir everything up and it's all going to get better overnight. That's not the reality. There are some real moral quandaries, and we talk at length in the book about these moral quandaries. In many cases, the United States and other nation states are forced to stay silent as women are oppressed under certain legal codes, for example. And this is not because we don't care about these women. So, you know, the archetypal example here would be Saudi Arabia. Okay, while she was Secretary of State, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton asserted that the subjugation of women is a direct threat to the security of our entire international system, Hillary Clinton felt to remain conspicuously silent about the treatment of Saudi women. And that's not because she doesn't care about those issues. I mean, there's no doubt. There's no way that one could accuse Hillary Clinton of not sincerely caring about women's issues. But it's because of, I think, a very clear-eyed view of the alternatives, right? Compared to the alternative sources of power in Saudi society, the current Saudi government looks really pretty good. Right? So what kinds of silences do we have to maintain in the context where we see no better alternative for women on the horizon? And I'm certainly convinced that what we called the Arab Spring was actually a winter for women in that area, where rights were summarily and immediately stripped from women as the regime changed to a freer system was put in place. Whether you talk to Egyptian women, whether you talk to Libyan women, even if you talk to Tunisian women and other women in the region, they can tell you case after case where they woke up the next morning and all of a sudden rights for which they had fought for decades were erased with the stroke of a pen. How could that be? Second, it's also very true that we need to be pragmatic, and that sometimes open support for women activists in other societies leaves them vulnerable to accusations of foreign intrigue and even treason. So are we actually putting some of these women at risk if we openly support them? That's another big moral quandary. And then there's the issue of jus ex bello, or that is principles of leaving a conflict zone and what our obligations are to the women that we leave behind. I believe our second panel on the situation of women in Afghanistan will be tackling this question, right? When I visited the UN 2 years ago and had a big lunch with women at UN Women, I was told that Americans have blood on their hands with respect to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, that we encourage these women to stand up, and now we have left them to fend for themselves, and that their fate is our responsibility. And if they are murdered, that's blood on our hands. That's another big moral quandary. Another one is what I sort of sardonically call the feminist hawks versus Pontius Pilate. And what I mean by this is we might be tempted to say, well, the United States is such a great power. Surely we can use that power on behalf of women worldwide. But, know, using things like military instruments to quote unquote help women may be misguided. Are the women of Iraq safer now because the American military invaded that country? No, absolutely not. And yet, on the other hand, as we look at the case of the Yazidi women who have been kidnapped and turned into sex slaves, surely the feeling also arises in our breast, can't we Americans do something about the Yazidi women? So I think these are two poles. We got to do something. Well, we can't do something because we'll make it even worse. That is another moral quandary. And then I think, as Provost Watson alluded to, what about our own house? Should we clean our own house first? The U.S. has not and probably will not ever ratify CEDAW. We have no paid maternity leave. I believe there's only 3 nations in the world who can make that claim. As Dean Crocker pointed out, slightly less than 20% of our national legislature is female. And we have significant levels of violence against women in our society. So what about our own domestic front? Another set of issues that we go over in our book, and that I think many of the panelists will talk about, is slow death by bureaucracy of a good idea, such as the Hillary Doctrine. I mean, wonderful things have taken place. We now have a national action plan for women, peace, and security that the US government formulated in 2011. The United Nations Security Council has not been sitting on its hands. We now have almost a dozen UN Security Council resolutions, you know, demanding and obligating that nations pay attention to what's happening to women. For those of you who are policy wonks, you will know the import of this. By golly, we actually have 9 gender indicators in the master indicator list by which all of our programs are benchmarked. There is now mandatory gender training. So if you want to join USAID, if you want to join the State Department, you will be taking courses in gender analysis. The quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review that looks at the activities of the State Department and the USAID. The QDDR report has numerous mentions of women and their importance to the areas of development and diplomacy. In fact, a gender analysis is mandated in all USAID requests for proposals now. Again, that's a little wonkish, but it really represents some progress here. And lastly, the Department of Defense itself has been active in this area and has several efforts on women, peace, and security that we'll be talking about in a moment with Michèle Flournoy. But there's still problems, right? Even under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the 4 years that she served in that position, some within the administration actually characterized attention to gender as a pet rock that was weighing down our rucksack and so had to be left by the wayside because there were more important things to do. Okay? So people genuflected to the idea that women were important. I can only imagine that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was a forceful personality in making sure that people agreed, at least on the surface, that gender was important. But many of them may not have taken it as seriously as she did and dropped it as soon as the going got tough. Some in our book, and we've even have wonderful comments by our own Dean Ryan Crocker, felt that there was a lack of will at the top. That these issues were too easily put aside when the going got tough. The second thing that I believe that has undermined the notion that women matter in foreign policy is the fact that we have no hard targets yet for a lot of these issues related to women. So for example, I think I told you that UN Security Council Resolution 1325 1325 mandates the presence of women at peace negotiations. But there's no one enforcing that. Even the US State Department has a pretty spotty track record of including women in peace negotiations. So for example, when Secretary of State John Kerry was assembling negotiations over the Syrian situation, outside activists actually had to ask, where are the women? We're obligated under 1325 to make sure they're at the table. We don't see them. Okay? So there actually had to be outside pressure for the State Department to include a token number of women. And this wasn't just on the Syrian side. It was also on the American side. Our own women were not being represented at the table as members of the State Department. And I'm sure Dr. Seema Samar will tell us about the High Peace Council of Afghanistan, where women have been absolutely marginalized. They are technically on the Peace Commission, but they don't meet with the Peace Commission in most cases. Right? So the lack of these hard targets has made it easy to say something rhetorical about women and then simply never follow through. And lastly, those of you who have actually worked on the ground in areas, and my co-author Patricia Lytle, whom we'll hear from shortly later this morning, has worked on the ground in places like Yemen and Afghanistan and other nations. The stories that are told about the kinds of subcontractors who are hired to implement programs concerning women will curl your hair. The types of implementers that we have that are visiting brothels, running brothels, who cannot work with women in their own office, and who undermine the gender programming at every turn. These are real and chronic issues that we face. Which brings us to this conference. That's one of the reasons why Texas A&M and the Bush School wanted to hold an intensive, high-level conversation about these issues. We need to be asking questions like, what does a state foreign policy that takes women seriously actually look like? Right? We know that Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström has announced that Sweden will have a feminist foreign policy. But yet at the same time, we know that she was forced to back down on criticism of Saudi Arabia. So how is this to happen? What does this look like? Secondly, what is U.S. responsibility towards the women of Afghanistan? Or more broadly, more abstractly, what does a jus ex bello doctrine, that is a doctrine that suggests what right behavior is in leaving a conflict zone, what does a jus ex bello doctrine that takes women seriously look like? I don't think we know that either. Given our experience over the first 15 years of the 21st century, what recommendations would we give to the next US president? What should be on their to-do list? And our third panel is going to be discussing that very question. We've assembled a stellar group of individuals that we hope will be addressing concrete recommendations and challenges at this timely season of presidential campaign and debate. What should be on the to-do list of American presidents? All in all, I think the theme of this conference is, how do we do this? Because I'm not sure that we know. But we've had enough years of experience now that we should be able, in a sense, to do what the military calls an after-action report. Okay? What did we do right? What are we not doing right? How do we avoid the same mistakes the next time? I have just a couple of concluding thoughts. I've studied these issues for many, many years, and I've compiled probably the largest database of information concerning women. It's called the Women's Stats Database, where we have information on over 350 variables for 176 countries from about the year 1995 onward. I've been in a position to track changes, progress, and regress for women over the last 20 years at a very detailed level. And I've come to a couple of conclusions. And the first one is, I do not believe that there can be peace within nations or between nations until there is peace between men and women, the two halves of humankind, both globally and within every society. The two groups through whom the future of these nations comes, the children of these nations. And secondly, I've also come to the deep conclusion that the roots of many things that we value, such as democracy and human rights, are to be found in the character of societal relations between men and women. How can you have democracy at the national level if you have no shared decision-making power within the household? How is anyone in that society going to understand democracy if what they see is autocracy within each household? It will not happen. And so these are things that are often not spoken of, but are critical to speak of at this time. And so, without further ado, I think that means that one of the most important discussions we can have is the discussion that we're going to have today. So I am thrilled to be a part of it, and let's begin. Let's go ahead and begin. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Michèle to come up here on the stage now, and while she does, we're going to have a conversation with Michèle Flournoy. And let me just say a few words about her. Michèle Flournoy is a co-founder and chief executive officer of the Center for a New American Security. And if you're not familiar with that organization, I think it's one of the brightest, most innovative think tanks around. She served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012. She was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and National Security Council deliberations. And she led the development of the 2012 strategic guidance for the Department of Defense. So she is definitely someone that we want to hear from at this time. Should you like to read more about her, I will refer you to the bios at the end of our program, which are much longer than we're able to recite here during the conference today. So let's go see if we can do this. Michèle, thank you so much for being here. I'm grateful to you for coming.
Happy to be here.
Now, Michèle, as I've just read in your biography, you've been in policy planning at an extremely high level in the Department of Defense. And your Center for a New American Security is in the business of providing well-thought-out recommendations for the U.S. national security establishment. In your view, what should be the place of issues of women's empowerment and security in U.S. national security planning?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Valerie, and thank you to Ambassador Crocker for inviting me to join you here today. I can't think of a more important and timely topic for us to be wrestling with. I think for all of the reasons, I thought your presentation was excellent in terms of bringing data to the question. Too often when we talk about these issues, it's seen as an issue of morality, it's seen as an issue of fairness, but it's not seen from a data-driven outcome and outcomes perspective. And so I think one of the things that needs to happen is more of this data that connects, the state of women in society and male-female relationships, to the kind of outcomes that do affect both the security of that nation, international security, our security, that needs to be brought much more to the fore. So I actually think that a lot of the things that you talked about, whether it was food security, whether it was poverty, whether it was propensity for violence and conflict, we talk a very good game about our primary objective being deterring and preventing conflict rather than having to go and respond to crises or fight wars and so forth. But we don't do a very good job of actioning that. I mean, of actually implementing our policy in a way that's really focused on prevention. So a lot of what I saw in your presentation is things that we should actually be tracking as to inform our policy of where do we need to be making what kind of investments, using all the tools of our power and influence, to try to shape some of these situations and actually prevent conflict or prevent crises that then sort of are much more costly in terms of blood and treasure to deal with.
That's great. Now, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, part of that responsibility under the National Action Plan was given to the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
From your perch in DOD, how is that received? Now, I know the Pentagon is a huge place, so it may be impossible to say some sort of general things, but was the Women, Peace, and Security agenda something DOD had already recognized as being important, or did that have to develop over time? What experiences did the U.S. military have in maybe seeing women in their campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq?
So I think, honestly, when this first came across the desk of folks in the Pentagon, the reactions ranged from just stupefaction, like, what is this and what does it have to do with me? I don't understand what this is, and what are you asking me to do? And to kind of an eye roll, oh, some politically correct requirement or something. And a lot of people came to me, well, you're the senior woman, you explain this to us. But what the interesting thing that I found is, so you take that sort of high-level reaction of just kind of bafflement, for everything from bafflement to kind of skepticism, to then when you started, you go down to people on the ground. And you talk to the Marines who first worked with female engagement teams. The first time the Marines in Helmand and elsewhere started to be able to access the female population in Afghanistan through female Marines, and first of all, got a lot of good information, and started really having a much better picture of what is really going on in their area of responsibility. Started being able to engage those women, bringing them into the discussions about where the community is going and what needed to be done. Started having a much better sense of where investment of effort and dollars and assistance could have a much more greater impact. So you talk to those folks, and you start to get a totally different appreciation. I mean, most of the people I met in the military and had the privilege of working with, they're not ideologues. They're all about the mission. What works? And what you are starting to hear from people on the ground is, hey, this emphasis on inclusion of women and paying attention to the women and engaging the women, it actually makes the mission go better. It actually works. And so as that started filtering up, you started getting a genuinely more engaged, a willingness to engage more genuinely at the policy level.
So what I hear you saying is that this was actually something that had to trickle up, right? So it didn't trickle down, it trickled up from folks in the field who had had real life experience.
I mean, it was being driven at the policy level, and we were sort of banging people about the heads and shoulders, but it wasn't really, it was a sort of reluctant compliance as opposed to, I'm going to embrace this because it's making me more effective. And once you saw that, I think you got a different level of reaction. And the challenge, I was talking with Brenda earlier about this, the challenge is there's so much turnover in the military that, one unit's learning curve you know, you can get to the point where you kind of start over with the next unit that comes into a zone and has to relearn those lessons if that transference of knowledge doesn't happen. And so how does that happen? It needs to happen in training and exercising. This needs to be a part of how new units are trained, because otherwise it's like Sisyphus. I mean, you roll the ball up the hill and you think, God, we're finally at the peak, and then the next deployment it kind of rolls back over you and you're down at the bottom somehow having to go up the hill again.
So actually that would be something that a future Secretary of Defense might be interested in, is actually kind of mainstreaming some of this training so that you don't lose all the memory of what people gain through hard experience in the field.
And it's very powerful. I mean, I've been through this with other issues before. So back in the 90s, you know, coming out of the Somalia experience, coming out of the Haiti experience, there was a time when most of our military training stopped at the war fighting. You know, you plan, you deploy, you take down the regime or you take the objective, and then the exercise ends. And I was like, wait a minute, then what? You know, where's phase 4? Where's the post-conflict reconstruction? And the truth is, it wasn't in the planning, it wasn't in the exercising, and people kind of looked at you like, I don't know, that's USAID or something, not really me. And so the truth is, you got to get it embedded in the planning, the doctrine, the training, the exercising, to really have this become real and sustained as an integrated part of what the understanding of how we are effective is in the military.
I've heard you talk about how commanders found that women, in a sense, were some sort of early warning indicator of what was going on in a community. Can you talk about this kind of idea that, you know, if a commander has an eye on what's going on with the women, they actually are going to see more than if they only concentrated on the men?
Right. So I think, you know, certainly areas where the oppression of women was greatest. I'm thinking of a place like Afghanistan. Those tended to be the most difficult environments to actually create security. I also think that women were just an incredible font of intelligence, whether it was helping figure out who the bad guys really were, or where the IED fields were, or who was corrupt, who was trustworthy and legitimate as a leader versus who was governing because they had the most guns or men under arms. I mean, it was just, you got a totally different level, a totally different and more nuanced picture of the society that you're walking into. And I think those commanders that figured out how to leverage that tended to do a lot better.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, I'd like to pick up on your idea of sustainability for a minute. I remember, you know, the FET teams, the female engagement teams that you spoke of, and how really crucial they were in a number of instances to getting the kind of intel the commander needed to avoid some sort of tragedy.
Definitely have to be concerned about the phenomenon that we learn over the course of long operations. We learn a lot of lessons. We develop a lot of best practices, but then, you know, they aren't necessarily, as you say, institutionalized or captured, and there's always the risk that next time you're doing something, you kind of forget that you ever learned these previous lessons. I'm not sure that the FET teams, you know, would work as a sort of MOS or a career path per se, but this is very relevant to the discussion that we're having now about what military operational specialties should be open to women. And as you know, Secretary Panetta, one of the things he did while he was Secretary of Defense, he said basically, and you know, the services have until 2016, January 2016, to comply with a policy that opens all military specialties to women, or ask for a waiver, apply for a waiver. And there was a story in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the Marines starting to send, having done various, tests and research, sort of signaling that they may actually ask for a number of waivers to keep women out. Now, if you had a fully integrated infantry or fully integrated ground force, you wouldn't necessarily need female engagement teams.
That's true.
The women are there, they're part of the unit, and so forth. You'd need some specialized training for them, but not a separate entity. So I think some of whether we need to institutionalize female engagement teams or not will depend in part on how this larger debate about what specialties women are open to women in the Marine Corps and the Army in particular, and in special operations forces. I think it's fascinating, while we've just had the different attitudes that are prevailing, I do think there's a generational component here too. Fewer issues with people who are younger and in the field and on the ground, in my experience. In the Army, we've just had 2 women actually make it through Ranger school. The Army's still debating about whether they'd actually be able to go be in Ranger units or be in any ground combat unit. Marines are having their debate. Meanwhile, Admiral Greenert, the CNO, says, SEALs, one of the most elite and difficult, challenging parts of our military, he said it point blank, without a blinking an eye, said, if women can get through BUDS, the SEAL sort of screening and training course, welcome women's SEALs. Why wouldn't anybody who can get through that course, male or female, they can serve. So it's very interesting to see how these different attitudes are playing out. But I do think this will affect not only the issue of, within the U.S. military, but also how we perform in missions where we're interacting with societies, half the population being women.
That's right. You don't have to silo women in a FET if women are already integrated into the team. I wonder how this differential approach of the various services will play out, because at some point the Marines will probably get pushback. I mean, if we do get Navy SEALs, if we do get women Rangers,
Marines will look a little bit silly for a waiver request.
Yes. I read the New York Times version of that article, and their tactic was that it was not a physical thing, it was some sort of operational effectiveness criterion. So something socially about the mixture of men and women.
So I do think that the people in a unit have to be able to perform the tasks. And so there are physical standards in the military, and different types of units that have different types of tasks, the standards may be different. I don't think the standards as they're currently set necessarily correlate strongly to the actual performance of tasks in units. But assume you could get the standards right, a standards-based approach, that's great. But the whole unit cohesion issue, I think, is overblown. And the folks that have really convinced me of this are some of the most challenging. The teams that face the greatest challenge in Afghanistan are called Special Operations A teams. These are the folks who go where nobody else goes. They're out in the most austere, most isolated, often most hostile environments, operating on their own in small teams of 12 to 15. Many of them had women integrated as either intelligence officers, logisticians, and for the purpose of engaging the female population. And to a team, every single team I have talked to and interviewed, they felt the women dramatically improved mission performance, and there were no issues whatsoever living in these conditions with women, just none. It's like, that's a leadership issue. It's just a non-issue. I mean, what are you talking about? Just not an issue. So their feeling was this policy debate was completely divorced from their operational experience. Now, maybe you can find some cases where there have been issues, but I think it is a question of leadership, it's a question of command climate, it's a question of culture, and it's a question of accountability. And it is something that I think if women can meet the standards, then the door should be open. And we can, with the right leadership, make the question of cohesion a non-issue, in my view.
Yeah, so the marine pivot is a little bit questionable because it may devolve to climate and culture, and that those things are inhibiting the effectiveness of the units, as versus the women themselves.
I mean, they're making an argument that the standard is meeting the standards is an issue. And I think we have to look very carefully at the details of the standards and the tests that have been performed and so forth.
And we know in civilian life that, for example, certain fire departments, when women were encouraged to join, set up artificially stringent physical requirements that, you were right, were proven in court not to correlate with the types of tasks that the units were doing. So there was actually a court challenge, a successful court challenge.
I think you have to, the other thing that is typically not adequately weighed is, after I came out of government, I spent 2 years with Boston Consulting Group trying to understand kind of best practice on management and leadership in the business world. And all of the business literature is clear on the issue that if you have a more diverse team, the performance of the company is better and the leadership makes better decisions. That diversity of the team is one of the long poles in the tent for increasing your profit, increasing your performance, increasing the quality of the leadership. And I mean, I think that has to be weighed as a key part of this equation.
Well, the military is all about effectiveness, so they should be interested in what actually works. All right, now, you have to forgive my frog. We would be remiss if you and I did not talk about the issue of sexual assault in the military. At the same time that we have our 2 first female Rangers graduating, we also have stunning figures on sexual assault in the military. I wonder if you could speak to that.
It's a horrendous and unacceptable problem. I think that we have to have a zero tolerance policy. The big debate is whether to try to strengthen, handle this through the chain of command, but supplement that with, advocates for the victims, better accountability, better reporting, et cetera, or take this out of the chain of command and create a separate sort of system of justice to try to get after this. And, when I first was wrestling with this issue, I really didn't know where I stood on that debate. And I asked to have dinner with a set of female JAGs, Judge Advocate Generals, these are the senior lawyers in the military, and the first female military judges to get their perspectives. And they were from different generations and different services, but it was really interesting to me in that they were unanimous in their view. And they said, look, if the overall objective is the full equal integration of women in the United States military, taking this out of the normal system actually sets back that goal. Because, now women are special cases, I roll. They said this is a question of leadership and command climate. Is it a question of justice and accountability? The tools are there to make this work. Yes, we need to augment it with better representation and advocates for victims and a whole range of other things. But what we need to do is be prosecuting people seriously, dishonorably discharging the offenders, making examples of them, making examples of the commanders who looked the other way and said, you look the other way, your career is over. That's going to end your career, not advance your career. So they said the system can work with the right leadership, with the right accountability, and the right implementation. And I think that's, frankly, what's being tried right now. I don't think enough is being done. But I think that, that's probably the path that we need to try first.
That's going to be on the to-do list for sure.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And, a footnote to this is it's important to understand this is not just a women's issue.
Yes. So the statistics are such that actually, in a raw numbers sense, there are more men sexually assaulted by men in the U.S. military than women every year. But because of this, the women make up a smaller percentage of the force, the percentage of women who are sexually assaulted is higher than the percentage of men. But this is an issue for men and women in the force. And again, I think the services are approaching this somewhat differently. In some cases, the zero tolerance policy is really being made real. In others, I think there's more to be done, work to be done.
What do you see as the role of women in foreign policy decision-making in the United States? In a sense, we talk about women needing to be at the table in peace negotiations, but women also need to be at the table in the Pentagon, the State Department, the National Security Council. How would you assess what we're doing there?
I think we've made progress, but I think we have a long way to go. I mean, again, I take as my premise the business literature that talks about the performance of teams when they're more diverse, being better and being higher. I think that's true in national security and policy making as well. When my first tour in the Pentagon back in the 90s in the Clinton administration, I decided it was kind of a lonely thing being a woman leader at that time, so I said, let's have a lunch for all of the senior women leaders in the Pentagon. And we fit at one table of, it was either 8 or 10. And for weeks afterwards, there was like the conspiracy theories that the women got together and had lunch. What were they plotting? What was going on? Now, at least, when I was in the Pentagon in 2012, I would say if you invited all the women leaders in the Pentagon, you'd actually overflow the executive dining room. So that's good.
That's great.
But at the very highest levels, it's still, I was still often the only woman in the room for many, many meetings. I think it's improving interagency, but still women are definitely the minority. And so I think, progress since the 1990s, definitely better now than it was, but more progress to be made.
A ways to go. Would you be willing to entertain a few questions from our audience?
Of course.
We'd like to open it now to the audience. You'll see that we have 2 microphones here, one on each aisle. If you would be pleased to come down, and if you'd state your name and where you're from or what you're affiliated with, and offer a question. I think we have about 12, 13 minutes. We could take your questions. Please don't be shy. This is a wonderful opportunity. The 2 women standing there work for me, so the rest of you have.
My name's Jane Heffelfinger. I'm with Texas State University. The question I have, could you elaborate a little bit more about the JAG luncheon that you had with that whole system of insider versus go outside?
So the female judges and JAGs I met with, their point was the system can take care of this problem, but it's not being properly used. So that their first point with this is about leadership and command climate. So commanders need to be made to understand that their promotion and their future in the service depends on how they handle these issues on their watch. And saying, well, so-and-so did a really good job in Afghanistan and Iraq, so I'm going to look the other way because somebody's making a charge against him. That's not okay. That they're part of their future and their performance is how they handle these issues that happen in their unit. And suppressing them, moving them, off to the side, trying to pretend they're not happening, that is a career-ending proposition for them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is making the justice system work and holding people accountable. So their view is, you know, we should stop plea bargaining. We should stop lowering charges. You know, if the evidence is clear and there's a conviction there, we should be drumming these offenders out of the service with dishonorable discharges as publicly as we possibly can. We should be making examples of them. You know, one of the things that appears to be true, although the data is a little bit squishy, you know, back in the time of Iraq when we had the surge and the Army had to grow the force very quickly. And they were keeping people in place, stop loss, not letting them leave the service at the end of their contract. They were extending tours from 12 to 15 months. They were pulling out all the stops. Part of what happened during that period is the Army in particular granted an unprecedented number of waivers for people who had criminal convictions, domestic violence convictions, rape convictions. Some of the serial offenders that have been sort of found in the sexual assault domain are people who had those waivers. And those people need to be found and driven out of the force.
Oh, that was a mistake.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any on this side?
Hi, good morning, Dr. Hudson. Good morning, Ms. Flournoy. My name is Julie Thompson. I am a graduate student of international affairs here at the Bush School. And Ms. Flournoy, I'm really glad that you talked a bit about how the number of women in the Pentagon has grown since the 90s. And I just wanted to ask you about how that's continuing to grow. And because I feel that as somebody who wants to be a national security professional, you know, women, we still feel as women that we're minorities in our classes and our internships. There's still not enough of us. So I wanted to ask, what advice do you have for women who are in my position now as starting out a career in hard security, but who want to be in your position? What advice do you have for us?
First of all, come on in, the water's fine. You know, don't shy away from the hard security issues or the places where women still seem to be a minority. It gets better with every administration, with every round of appointees, with every round. The thing that heartens me is women coming out of security-related or graduate programs are fully half. So the pipeline is there. The jobs are opening up more and more at the top. And you know, so I think by the time you get there, the opportunities will be there. The second thing I would say is, to the extent, you know, short of actual harassment, when you encounter bias, you know, one of my first meetings in the Pentagon back in the 90s, I was, you know, 29, civilian, female, Democratic political appointee. I had every possible strike against me. And my counterpart, who was a one-star general, said, "Now what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" And I just came right back. I said, "Well, what's a nice Southern boy like you doing in a place like this, General?" You know, I mean, just let it be. Use humor. Let it be the other person's problem. Walk right past it and say, in a week, he'll have no question about why I'm here, because I'm going to knock his socks off by how well I perform and how excellent my work is. And so suddenly that flips to becoming, as the provost said, oh, that incredible woman. You know, and she's not, it's incredible because you managed to put a sentence together and you're a woman. It's like the talking dog phenomenon, you know, wow. So, but don't let it get, you know, don't try to just let it be the other person's problem. Focus on being excellent. Focus on finding those bosses and mentors who can see you for what you are and who appreciate your work and who are going to invest in you and promote you.
That's great. That's great. Excellence is always a cure for that kind of small-mindedness. Please.
Hi, I'm Michèle Taylor Robinson. I'm professor in political science at A&M. And it's been fascinating to listen to this. I study women in politics, but in sort of not the non-defense aspect of government. So seeing these insights, I have a question. And you just mentioned in your advice to the junior colleague, don't shy away from the hard security issues. Makes totally good sense. But I was curious, with the FETs and the question about, you know, should that be an MOS or a career path? So this is actually a question to both of you. We find with women in legislatures in the US and in other countries that oftentimes if they pursue women's issues, that's not good for their career because they seem to be getting ghettoized into those special topics. And I'm curious if you think, because it's clearly FETs have been useful in the military, and it takes some training to make it work. Do you think this might be a dangerous career path for a woman seeking a career in the military?
So my worry about institutionalizing the FETs is that at this stage in the development of this issue, my worry is that, oh, that's a FET issue. And so it becomes like, I'm the male infantry officer. I don't have to worry about this because that's a FET issue. Or I'm the senior general. I don't have to really think about this because that's a, I mean, I worry about it being used as a way to sort of, oh, we have these special women who deal with these women's issues, as opposed to really mainlining and mainstreaming and integrating this into how we think about approaching these operations writ large. So again, I think that part of this will depend on how the broader integration of women into a range of career fields. But in my perfect world, you'd have women where they can pass the standards. You'd have women in a broad range of ground units who essentially can also be trained, as a special part of their training, to have that as a sort of part of their additional duties, if you will. But that it would be it would just be totally integrated, and there you wouldn't have to recreate it or as a special thing that others may therefore kind of unload the issue or marginalize the issue.
Wonderful. Let's go to this side.
Good morning, Marimar Miguel. I'm a first-year student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I'm actually a graduate from here from Texas A&M. So my question is,
we'll forgive you then.
Huh?
We'll forgive you then, right?
Okay. My question is, what about race? And so what conversations are happening about the intersection of race and gender? Because looking around the room, very few people of color here. Very few people of color in the military. So what conversations are happening about race in the military, in defense, in security, that you've had experience with?
When you look at national security writ large, actually the statistics, the military has done a better job of integrating people of color than the rest of the national security apparatus. And this is a real, it's much easier to find qualified women in the pipeline than it is to find people of color. You look at the PhD programs, they don't look like America. That pipeline is not there. One of the things we're doing as a demonstration project at CNAS, my think tank, so we're partnering with Thurgood Marshall College Fund and to create a pipeline for interns to be trained at CNAS and then be able to launch into public service in the federal government. And we're tiny. We're a tiny little think tank. But our point is we're going to prove the concept that this works. You can find the qualified talent. You can train them. You can make them successful. And then we're going to go to every other think tank in Washington and shame our brethren into doing the same thing so we create more of a pipeline. Because when I was undersecretary and trying to hire, the pipeline was appalling with regard to people of color.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question before our break. Please.
Hi, my name is Nikki Van Hightower. I'm a retiree of the Department of Political Science here at Texas A&M University. I read with great interest about the two women in the special units or special forces or whatever it was in the Army, and it was breathtaking what they accomplished and went through for men and for women. And I couldn't help but think in reading about this, is this really necessary? And I know you mentioned a little bit that maybe some analysis was being done on exactly what is necessary to do these jobs. You know, we've done it in police departments, we've done it in fire departments, and we found that there was a lot of stuff that wasn't really necessary. Is there any work being done? Is there analysis being done? Is that even touchable?
I think that work will be done to the extent that a large number of waivers are ultimately requested. that will drive a much more rigorous approach to saying, okay, do we really have the standards right? Because the truth is, the standards for, you know, a Marine Corps platoon are going to be different than the standards for joining the Ranger Battalion. I mean, the Rangers are elite. They are among the most men wash out of Ranger training. Most men wash out of SEAL training. So they are the cream of the crop. They're doing extraordinary things that we don't ask other people in the military to do, right? So you're going to have to go specialty by specialty and really define, no kidding, what are the standards to do the job well. And that's going to take some time. I think the scope of that effort will depend on how many waivers are requested. But where waivers are requested, I'm quite confident that that kind of work will be demanded. It's being done in a haphazard way that's not necessarily rigorous and objective. So, I mean, I think some of this has been done internally. I don't think that will be found to be acceptable. I think there will be a much more impartial and objective approach that sort of says, you know, that's looking at this issue. If the waivers are pursued on a large scale.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're about to take a 10-minute break, but before we do, join me in thanking Michèle Flournoy for her remarks.
Thank you for the wonderful energy in the room. It's been terrific, and I know we're going to have a fantastic first panel, chaired by Charlie Ponticelli. So as soon as they've gotten all mic'd up, I'm going to hand it over to Charlie, okay?
Thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with so many old friends, new generations who are coming behind us and picking up our baton. I do first want to say that although all of us here are so disappointed that Gloria Steinem could not join us in person, we're thrilled to learn that she is with us now, not just in spirit, but watching our proceedings via live stream. So, howdy, Gloria. Like Valerie, I think that we really want to dive into the discussion, the biographies of these amazing experts, activists, change leaders here today. If I were to list their accomplishments, it would take the whole time for our panel. So I will just mention briefly, I do encourage you to look up their bios. They're amazing accomplishments. First, we have with us today Robin Morgan. Robin is an award-winning novelist, poet, activist, journalist, editor. She's the author of 22 books, and I think for me, the thing that really grabbed me looking at the body of her work were the titles of her classic anthologies. Sisterhood is Powerful, Sisterhood is Global, and Sisterhood is Forever. Amen. Anne-Marie Goetz, New York University. Anne-Marie teaches international relations at NYU, and she has served as chief advisor to UNIFEM and UN Women. I love the range of topics that she has covered in her work, in her teaching, and in all her experience and activities. Let me mention a few. Democratization, politics of recovery in fragile states, women's participation in public decision-making, public accountability systems, and in terms of policy-making, preventing sexual violence in conflict, effective peace building. Some of the themes, again, a conviction that young people must be more effectively engaged in the struggle for gender equality. Another theme, the value of norm development and addressing the unfinished agenda of women's rights. and also the capacity of technology to enable a deepening of the women's rights process. I picked a phrase out of one of her writings that I think is just fabulous. Women's human rights have no country. And we're especially pleased to have with us on this panel Patricia Lytle. Patricia is standing in for one of our colleagues, Lauren Wolf, who was hit with the strep throat. And I understand Lauren, I think, is also with us via the live stream. So howdy, Lauren, and we wish you could be here. But we're happy to have Patricia as well. And why? Well, I think, first of all, because she is the co-author of this wonderful book, which I hope you get and read. It's pretty interesting, and it's a very unique compendium of past accomplishments, future challenges, and present endeavors. So I really want to lead off with our three panelists with some of the questions that Valerie posed when she brought us together. She wanted our panel to look at the question, when we're considering a state foreign policy that would really take seriously the cause of women and girls, what should that policy look like? What would look different? What would our priorities be? Who would our allies be or not be? What would our red lines look like? And how do we, following on to Michèle's presentation, how do we do that balancing act of the separate entities to get us from point A to B versus the ultimate goal of integration of women's issues in all sectors of activity and the mantra for mainstreaming? How do we close the implementation gaps? How do we close that gap between rhetoric and action? So without further ado, we will start with our three panels. And Robin, will you lead off?
I'd be glad to. Can you all hear? Well, I'll do the thing. Howdy. Howdy. My God, it works. I'm going to set my own little timer here because I've got an awful lot to cover. So I may go pretty rapidly, but when we get to the Q&A, the most interesting part, anything that you want to return to, I'll be glad to elaborate on. I want to start by thanking the inspirers of this conference, the wonderful Valerie Hudson and Patricia, not only for this book, but for the other extraordinary research that they've done. Sex and World Peace is a groundbreaking book. If you don't know, that was the one preceding Hillary Doctrine. Incredibly important. Their scholarship has made honest women of the women's movement after years of our saying the same thing anecdotally. Now they've proven we were always right. Thank you very much. These are extremely distinguished academicians at the conference and policymakers. I am simply a humble country writer and activist and organist, or not an organist actually, organizer. So I'm coming from that perspective, and one of my aims is to get us away from fashionable ways of dealing with, quote, gender, and remind us that there's a real world of real suffering happening out there, and it has to do with women, because the W word gets lost a lot these days in the G word. It's fashionable, for example, to speak of having a gender lens, that we have to develop a gender lens of factoring women into things. I would submit that we have to do the reverse, that we've had a gender lens imposed by patriarchal thinking, and we need to strip that off so that we don't just see half of the world that happens to have penises. Yes. Okay, the seriousness of what's at stake and the enormity of what we're really talking about here. Just a very few stats to add on to what Valerie went through this morning. Just quick around the world in 80 seconds. 90% of the refugee populations in the world, which is all the headlines today,
are women and children and the displaced populations. 2/3 of all illiterates are women, and while the general illiteracy rate is falling, the female illiteracy rate is rising. Pollution and toxic waste take their first tolls as cancers of the female reproductive system and in stillborn births across the Pacific, for example, when French atomic testing was happening there. Rural to urban migration takes its first toll on women who are either left behind to work on arable land or who try to follow men into the cities where they find they're considered less educable, less employable, and where their opportunities actually have to do with factory work at less than $1 US a day, or have to do with being domestic servants, or have to do with working in prostitution. The standard model of radiation tolerance in the scientific community is that of a male of 150 to 160 pounds in his late 30s or early 40s. This happens to leave out female people and most of the men in Asia. Pale males are the standard of what's human, and we're dying because of it, all of us, including even pale males. So all issues are women's issues. Let's never again use the phrase women's issues. Women suffer first and worst from every world problem, and we are the last and least considered. So we're here to talk about women and foreign policy, which really translates into women and power. We don't often like to put those words together as if, ooh, power, not a male thing. And it's understandable why some women have fled from power, because the guys haven't used it arguably very well. That's no reason it can't be redefined. We're talking about power to, not power over. I'm going to suggest 5 specific and general things that I hope will be taken up as themes maybe by other panelists later today, just to put them out there. Some are specific, some are more general. They are not in order of precedence. In fact, if anything, they overlap and they intersect. But I hope that they might be useful. First, listen to women. Last night at the dinner, wonderful journalist Alyssa Rubin touched on this, but every organizer knows that that's step 1. We are here at this conference because as early as the early 1970s, the women's movement was dealing with the question of what about women in foreign policy. Indeed, Ms. Magazine in the early 1970s did a special issue and convened a round table. It was chaired by the late Congresswoman Bella Abzug and Pat Darien of the State Department on women and foreign policy. So this has always been a trickle up. It was not something that people in the State Department or in policy circles woke up one morning, fell on a platitude with an air of enormous discovery and said, well, you know, women. We have been pounding our fists on the doors of power, this wave alone, and it's not the second wave, it's more like the 10,000th, for 50 years and not listened to. We are here thanks to the Bush School for Politics. And yet we pounded our fists on the doors of that administration, both Bush administrations, and other administrations for decades about Afghanistan and gender apartheid there, but nobody did anything or was interested in doing anything until after 9/11. And that's when we went into Afghanistan and claimed it was also for the women. So listen to the women. This affects foreign aid, which is a very strong part of foreign policy. When there was the major famine in the Sahel, the State Department went in with aid, as did other aid agencies, and replaced the dead cattle with a head of cattle to each family. But they gave it to, quote, head of household, which they assumed were men. Now, the men were heads of household, but traditionally, cattle care was the women's job. It was handed on generation to generation. The women knew how to do it, and they were so offended that the cattle were given formally to the men who didn't know how to care for the cattle. The men didn't know how to do it, the women refused to do it, and all the cattle died. Number 1, listen to the women. Number 2, connect the dots. This shouldn't be hard, and yet you'd be amazed. I have been in screaming matches with senators over whether population and overpopulation was relevant to women's reproductive rights. Honest to God. And yet we know that in any area where women are educated and given real reproductive choice, organically and naturally population rates fall. Connect the dots. In the United States here at home, the single most effective boost to the economy would be equal pay for women. Connect the dots. Hillary Rodham Clinton, when she was Sec State, arranged for hundreds of thousands, it may have been in the millions, you would be able to correct me on this, of smokeless stoves to go to women in the global south because there are such high rates of emphysema, lung cancer, tuberculosis, etc. This, of course, is a health issue for women and families. But interestingly enough, it's also an environmental issue because smoke stoves burn and produce black carbon. Black carbon is a major pollutant, but unlike other pollutants, when it gets in the atmosphere, it lasts for a short time unless you're producing more of it. So the less black carbon is in the atmosphere, the more it actually disappears. Connect the dots. Make the connections and hammer them over and over and over because the guys can tend to forget. 3, the economic aspect. Women don't basically around the world exist in capitalism or any other system other than feudalism because women's unpaid labor is a global, shocking shame. For example, if a woman is in labor, and let's say she's in labor in the best circumstances, she's in a hospital, there's a midwife, there's a doctor, there's an obstetrician, there's nurses, there's an anesthesiologist if she wants it, they're all there. Each of those people, their work is considered productive because they exist in the formal wage market. The woman in labor is not considered productive. She's not producing anything, you understand. So since we're based on a market economy, most women don't exist in that sense. We're not considered to have any value. I would recommend the book If Women Counted by Marilyn Waring because among other things she exposes where this system came to be. It's based on the United Nations system of national accounts. The UN SNA itself was created by John Maynard Keynes and Sir Richard Stone, both of them British, one American, one British, who co-authored a paper entitled The National Income and How to Pay for the Wars. That is the system on which the United Nations system of national accounts is based. The first thing that you can do, and everybody can do this, is to pressure your government, in this case the United States, but every national government, to factor women and women's work in all that unpaid labor, gardening, housework, child raising, child producing. We produce the labor force. To factor that into the census forms because the GDP shifts by 40 to 60%. It's vast. That's something everybody can do. Where are we up to? We're up to 4. And I'm closing. Never underestimate the value of individual audacity in moving systemic change, because these are systemic problems that we're facing. But individual acts of audacity are not only fun and outrageous, but they make enormous differences. For example, my beloved friend Navi Pillay, just until about a year ago, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, back when she was Judge President of the Rwanda Tribunal in Arusha, entered into the annals the concept that rape in war is a crime against humanity. Now, well, might we ask, if rape in war is a crime against humanity, then what the hell is it in peacetime? But we take this one step at a time. That was a huge act of audacity, and it now exists in judicial annals. The kind of academic audacity that Valerie and Patricia show in producing the kind of studies that they do, or that Dr. Naomi Oreskes has done in unmasking who the climate change deniers really are. Power audacity in office or in policy circles like that of Margot Wallström. And ingenuity and audacity. Gender Force being a perfect example, founded by a Swede that is currently deployed in both Afghanistan and in Congo to protect. It is taking the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect, which I hope we get back to at some point, which has been batting around for 10 years in UN circles and nobody doing anything about it. It is an actual force deployed to protect women in crisis situations. It's run by women. The force is male and female combined. And fifth, we have to sever the toxic cathexis between violence and eroticism, and the combination being defined as what is manhood. I spent an entire book, The Demon Lover, on this, and that is the hardest thing in front of us at all. But basically, I don't think we can ask, is it possible to make these changes? The point is that it is not only necessary, it's imperative. This is the missing link. Women are the politics of the 21st century, and not only for the fairness in terms of women, but for the salvation of the planet. I came in just about a minute over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for those powerful comments. And Anne-Marie, we now turn to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Bush School. Congratulations to Patricia and Valerie for their book, and thank you to Valerie for your leadership in this area. And also thank you to all of you for the interest and commitment that you've shown to this issue. I'm going to speak about the imperative of the US taking a very strong, unambiguous leadership role globally on women's rights. And I'm going to talk about the emergence of, for want of a better word right now, a new Cold War on women's rights, an increasingly coordinated global backlash that has to be countered. And in the process, I will answer your questions about what are some priorities for foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy. Because I am sure to run out of time, I will start at the end with my list of key elements of a feminist foreign policy, and I will come back to the list. And funnily enough, my list starts with yours, your first point. Listen to women. The US has got to exercise a politics of recognition, respect, and solidarity with women around the world, and that requires breaking the silence and invisibility. It is an act that is often largely symbolic, but has enormous impacts in terms of taking concrete efforts to out women from silence and invisibility. The second is a politics of redistribution. It is inescapable, looking at the redistribution of foreign aid and trade and military resources. We have to look for it and we have to pay for it if we want to have women's rights internationally. The third is, of course, domestic feminist activism has to be fostered and connected to international feminist activism, fostering and supporting and building women's leadership domestically and abroad, building women's power. And in the process, the US has got to do more to build a global alliance for women's rights to counter increasingly coordinated backlash forces. Another point is leave no vacuums. There have been vacuums of governance in parts of the world, and nothing loves a vacuum like radical extremists. The US has to stand up for women's rights at every opportunity in every place. And finally, a politics of accountability and consequences for neglect of a women's rights agenda, which will require questioning some of the US's alliances. Let me now make it very clear that the US is already a global leader on women's rights. I worked at the UN for a decade as an advocate for women's rights in peace and security, and I knew where I had to go when I needed a friend, and I always did. But the US mission was home. And this is very important to know that the US is a leader on women's rights and human rights. But yes, it could be more consistent, and it could act sometimes with a lot more conviction. The issue of where is the conviction in top leadership is something that has to be addressed. Geopolitics, geopolitical factors shape opportunities for the acceptance or rejection of demands for women's rights internationally. The interests of states and the relations between them and their relations with powerful non-state actors, ranging from armed groups to private corporations, shape women's rights everywhere and shape opportunities to advance the status of women. So the way the United States navigates past the current global squeeze on women's rights will have massive repercussions for feminism around the world in years to come. If I give a brief post-war history sketch of the story of women's rights internationally and the US's role, we have the formation of the UN after the war, and the US's response to its tension, its Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the East was to limit the UN's power over domestic politics and also to limit the idea of the expansion of women's rights as a very distinct area within the UN system. Now, this changed in the 70s. There was a temporary abatement of the Cold War. There was détente with the Soviet Union and China, and a major wave of post-colonial decolonization, which meant that the US had to contend with the rising G77 and non-aligned states, many of whom actually turned out to be quite interested in women's rights, having had women's participation in national liberation movements. The US emerged in the early 70s, in fact, as the out-front leader on women's rights in the United Nations, in the multilateral field. It sponsored International Women's Year, it sponsored the International Women's Conference, and it sponsored the drafting of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So, and that was actually, of course, a Republican administration that did that. It also, under the next administration, sponsored the Houston Conference, the famous Houston Conference, which provided a massive boost to the domestic feminist and women's movement in the US. There was a stagnation or a stalling of all of this in the 1980s and a backtracking of multilateralism and interest in CEDAW. And then in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, there was a third wave of democratization, tremendous expansion of international NGOs and women's rights movements, and the major international conferences that set up huge achievements on women's rights and agreements on women's rights: Vienna, Cairo, Beijing. And of course, now in the post-9/11 period, and particularly since about 2008, which I mark with the Russian invasion of Georgia, actually, there's been a re-refrigeration of relations between the East and West, and a lot more rigidity in international negotiations on women's rights. There's been what's called the democratic recession or stalling. There's been the occupation of governance vacuums in Somalia, Libya, Mali, Afghanistan by extremists, extremely violent groups, often Islamist extremists, environmental and economic crises, and regrettably, the US's loss of credibility as a leader on human rights because of the fallout of invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't want to depress you, but I think we need to take stock of the current situation, and it is sobering. Assumptions about a continuous upward progress in democratization around the world have been unseated by a range of developments, such as those I just mentioned, and an erosion of democracy even in the West, with the rise of oligarchic types and patterns of decision making in important democracies, and even here, of course, where money trumps merit in competition for power, and of course, even an individual called Trump is representing that kind of oligarchic decision making. The defeat of revolutionary ideologies in the 20th century has also paved the way for new types of anti-globalization and anti-imperialism, which have shifted from goals like democracy, economic development, human equality, and secularism, and a belief in alternatives to capitalism, to a metastasizing form of extreme hyperviolence, masculinist expression only in violence, religious fundamentalism, ethnic chauvinism, anti-modernism, all of which is articulated as anti-US positions. So regrettably, when the US supports women's rights, that then becomes the reason to oppose it by many of these anti-imperialist groups. These shifts in political and social attitudes are compounded by the deepening of inequalities within and between states. And these inequalities are sharpening, not eroding, gender differences. And I believe that's what you were alluding to as well. Just to sort of, I'm surely running out of time, so I am. Now, what we've seen at the UN is the emergence of an explicit anti-feminist global coalition. And it actually has a name, and it has a process. It's a bureaucracy. It's called the Group of the Friends of the Family. Sounds sweet, but this group was announced in January this year by the ambassador of Belarus. And let me just tell you who the members are. Belarus, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Kuwait, Libya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Qatar, Russia, Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Turkmenistan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. That was the group in January. It's since expanded considerably. Now, this is a very curious allowance of current US allies, some of the world's biggest democracies with huge feminist movements like Nigeria and Malaysia and Indonesia, plus former socialist states that are creeping towards being failed states, Islamist theocracies, and just plain autocratic, kleptocratic states. What do they have in common? They have in common a commitment to erode women's rights and also the rights of sexual minorities. And this group is operating as a bloc. Every year before the Commission on the Status of Women, the Holy See treats them to a retreat in Arizona at a spa where they get training in how to negotiate in international negotiations on women's rights. They're given explicit language. Where is the Coalition on Women's Rights? The reason there isn't an explicit one is because there is a reluctance to suggest this is a Western issue, which of course it is not just a Western issue at all. So I'm out of time, so what do we need? Coming back to the policy of recognition, solidarity, and redistribution. The US is a global leader on women's rights. It is a nation that is also a universal idea. It has had a complex and ambivalent relationship with multilateralism, and it has to get past its reluctance to engage in multilateralism. It's got to be a leader on these universal values, and it can lead without resorting to military intervention. There's got to be inspiration in partnership. This means bringing commitments to women's rights not just into foreign aid projects, but re-examining the US's alliances, clients, trade relations, and asylum and immigration laws. It also means a clearer legislative framework for this, which means, I don't know, maybe CEDAW never will be ratified, but it's still got to be kept on the Foreign Relations Committee agenda, also passing the International Violence Against Women Act. Third, a politics of recognition requires going out there and looking for the women, because you won't see them if you're involved in the homosocial project of men talking to men about what they think only concerns men. You gotta look for them. That means promoting affirmative action policies, saying we won't engage in peace talks unless there's women there, and so on. A politics of solidarity requires building women's power and constituencies, so it's not the US saying this is what women want, it's women saying this is what women want. And mechanisms for uniting include things like building networks. The biggest non-event this year, the biggest non-event in this year of anniversaries was the holding of a 5th World Conference on Women's Rights, which was due this year on the 20th anniversary of Beijing. These conferences build solidarities and networks. I'm rushing since I'm out of time. Institutionalizing change in the State Department and other parts of the US administration has to require serious money and appointment of significant high-level staff to positions on women's rights. And that includes, just from my perspective when I was at the UN, negotiators at the Security Council that were sent by the P5, including the US, on resolutions on women's rights tended to be rather junior, and this would be their first assignment. That's not right. We need the same kind of seniority that Iran is sending to these negotiations. Polished, experienced diplomats who know how to bargain. Avoid vacuums, sustain a middle class and women's collective action and accountability. I have no time. I will just finish with the point that you alluded to, the Virginia Woolf quote. We were quoting her last night, so here's a quote from Virginia Woolf, very important, from The Three Guineas, her political polemic. As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. Now, this has been important in women's rights. Transnationalism is the arena in which we've been fighting for women's rights. But the time has come for a country. Women need a country, as we know. We need many countries working in alliance for women's rights, and the US should be a leader in its foreign policy on this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. You have packed a lot into a great presentation, and now you will be followed by your colleague, yes. Our colleague, Patricia Lytle, who, again, we're so grateful she could pick up the baton for Lauren. Like Lauren, Patricia's a journalist, and like Anne-Marie, Patricia has quite a great deal of experience with UN agencies and with multilateralism. So I hope you will get to sprinkle your own insights regarding that.
That will probably have to wait for the Q&A because I've been tasked to actually read Lauren's speech, which I'm happy to do. I have abbreviated it, and Lauren, if you're watching, please, I'm sorry, I've tried to maintain your voice as much as possible, so without much ado, I'll go on. So Lauren Wolf, she's not here today, but she is here in spirit. When does the violation of women's bodies become a red line? How many millions of lives must be ruined or lost before we consider that a red line? I'm not talking about the random acts of violence, but the systematized use of rape, mutilation, and torture undertaken by armed forces or militias controlled by governments and opposition and other non-state actors. I am talking here about a policy of specifically targeting women and girls for some of the most horrifying abuses conceived by the human imagination. 2 years ago this week, I became angry. I'd been tracking sexual violence in the Syrian war for a long time and had received little response from policymakers despite many meetings with those in our government, that of the UK, and of course, the UN. Cases piled up along with the bodies, and yet the response was nil. And now, suddenly, President Obama was responding, but not to cases of rape or torture, but to the possible use of chemical weapons. It was his so-called red line, the one thing that would propel his administration into action. Okay, so chemical weapons are abhorrent, but so too is the wholesale destruction of female bodies and minds. How many lives will be destroyed before the security of women's bodies and the sanctity of our rights becomes a red line? So during those angry days, I spoke with Eve Ensler, the author of the Vagina Monologues, who advocates on behalf of women in the DR Congo, a country embroiled in 16 years of warfare that has claimed the lives of as many as 8 million people. As many of you know, the DR Congo is one of the worst countries in the world in which to be born a woman. For like Syria, all parties to the conflict target women and girls, so much so that the researchers have coined the term vaginal destruction to describe the extreme nature of the abuse. For how many years, Ensler asked me, have we been banging on the doors of the White House saying thousands and thousands of women have been raped? Ensler, like many I spoke to, was not and are not advocating for a military intervention in places where women bear the brunt of the fallout of war. They are asking for a political intervention based on human rights violations, but still, no one seems to be listening. Why? For one thing, world leaders like representatives in Congress have turned a blind eye to the violence for a simple reason. It does not disturb their preconceived notions about where violence is normal. If people divide their understanding of militarized violence into normal and not normal, acceptable and not acceptable, it makes a terrible kind of sense. Violence against women has been normalized, especially in Africa. The example of the refugee crisis and inaction can be explained perhaps by the response to one particularly damning question. Do the people at risk matter to the people in power? And the answer, it would seem, is no. So from here, I want to imagine a world in which all people matter, including women and girls. What would that look like? And here, as Lauren's proxy, I'll just paraphrase what she described in the next few paragraphs of her speech, which will be, I understand, uploaded online and which you can access later on. Because Lauren is a journalist, she's been privileged to meet the women who are most affected by this lack of foreign policy attention, as I have in my work in Afghanistan and Yemen and Central America. In her full speech, which we can post online, she describes two women, Abir and Reem, Syrian refugees whose lives are defined by the limitations of being born female and poor in a region that respects neither. Reem is pretty, so she was married against her will to a Libyan trader who will likely abandon her. Abir, a hairdresser, is too impoverished to even afford the tools of her trade. Both face hopeless futures. Lauren continues, I find it fascinating that while the media talks about the radicalization of bored young men in the Middle East, they are silent when it comes to the likes of Abir's mental health. Could the Islamic State survive if women were not also lured by the promise of a so-called better life? Putting aside for now that girls like her sister are being sold off into a marriage, let's think about what happens to others. Does it also not make sense for our foreign policy to address what occurs to this lost generation of young women and to stop thinking about the young men only. And apart from fears of radicalization, for the basic reason that educating and employing young women makes economic and social sense, as we've seen with the previous speakers. The women and girls that I've met living the reality of war all over the world tell me that armed conflict is not what the media makes it out to be. It is not bombs, or not just bombs, be they barrel bombs, cluster bombs, bombs dropped by drones, or lobbed over walls. War is what happens to the people caught in the war zone. And those people are mainly civilians, often refugees, who, according to researchers, make up nearly 90% of conflict-related casualties. In other words, the safest place to be in a modern conflict is the guy with the gun. War is trauma, and it is lack of mental health care that accompanies it. War is rape, and the silence and the suffering that surrounds the victims, but neither the act nor the perpetrator. War is the acknowledgement that soldiers are worthy of reparations when they're injured, but that civilians who have been sexually violated or are born of rape, such as an entire generation of kids now living in Rwanda, are not. It took 20 years to bring reparations to any victims of wartime rape in Bosnia, and it's worth noting that the men who've been ordered to pay insist that they can't afford the piddling $15,000. And because I work in media, I ask myself why it is that what happens to women and children are considered soft stories, soft or pink stories, are traditionally left off the front page. Is it because a media run by men reflects and prioritizes male experience? In the policy realm, are these soft issues not hard enough because women are not at the highest levels of government in equal numbers? It is because they are not at Is it because they are not at negotiating tables when it comes to creating peace in their countries? Or is this just a symptom? Almost 15 years after the signing of UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, peace agreements are almost exclusively negotiated by men and for men. An NGO leader who pushed for the inclusion of Syrian women at the Geneva Peace Talks last year, named Habak Osman, said, "When we talk about women at the table, the men see them as the tablecloth." She also said, "The future of Syria should not exclusively be decided by those who carry guns." What if we, instead, conceived of what we think of as a soft war, the one that includes civilians as the predominant feature of fighting in the 20th century? Maybe we would think about and address the plight of refugees differently. We would think of what it does to girls like Reem and Abir, but also how to stop a sharp uptick in cases of domestic violence, which occurs when unemployed men become frustrated and take it out on their wives, the one person more powerless than they are. Could we somehow prevent this, knowing full well that it is a typical feature of life and of a life of displacement and statelessness? The bottom line is that this isn't just about women when we discuss them in the context of foreign policy and national security. Sexual trauma and violence destroys families with repercussions that cut through multiple generations. It guts communities and sows the seeds of future violence. And it isn't just about assisting victims, but also attempting to rehabilitate perpetrators, or better yet, assisting societies to understand gender-based violence for what it is, and before it occurs. And that is this: gender-based violence is the most pervasive and entrenched of human rights violations inflicted on one half of the population by the other half. Which brings us to the proverbial elephant in the war zone. What happens to former soldiers in places like Congo, where researchers reveal that men who are not properly counseled and reintegrated into civilian life after demobilization will continue to rape? These same researchers also discovered something very strange, that when the fighting ends, the incidence of rape increased by as much as 17 times. So why, too, does our coverage of war end when the bullets stop flying and the bombs stop falling? The reality is that these kinds of disconnects exist all over the world. From South Sudan to Afghanistan, we hear about only a slice of what makes up the experiences of conflict. And importantly, from my journalist perspective, I can't help but point out that media attention shapes diplomatic and military response. So when the media gives its airtime or column inches to something like the use of chemical weapons in Syria, rather than rape as a weapon of war, that is what we will draw possible intervention or even medical aid. So again, one is a red line, but the other is not. I have met too many women in my reporting who have never seen or ever considered justice in their lives for the crimes they've suffered. Next to nobody is prosecuting these crimes. Next to nobody is handing them money or assistance. The fact is that justice is utterly unattainable for women in many parts of the world. It is knocked aside by the larger issues of conflict, aka the male issues. There are still major problems in tribunals and with witness protection that prevent women from wanting to come forward. At a more local level, there is the problem of police, who are usually men. They laugh, bribe, or re-rape women seeking an arrest. This unceasing cycle of violence, in part, depends on how we prioritize it. If we pay attention to all facets of the conflict, as a select few are doing, if we can gain the attention of policymakers, can the world become a more peaceful place in which both women and men's lives are valued equally? I, for one, am glad that there are so many of you out there pushing the boulder up the hill. Thank you. Lauren Wolf.
Great job, great job. Briefly, because we have just a little bit of time left, so maybe 10 minutes, 10, 15, with an interaction among the three of you. And because there's so little time, there's so many questions that pop into my head, but I think the biggest one is the one that Valerie mentioned this morning. The very simple yet weighty question, how do we do this? So that's the question I want to throw out to you all. We're looking at the headlines now. I think it's wrong to say that the world isn't watching, listening, or seeing what's going on. It's what do we do and how do we do this? How do we create the critical mass of alliances that we need for the critical questions that we're seeing? How do we find those resources and distribute those resources that Anne-Marie talked about? Maybe a rapid response fund that might help those whose lives are on the red line now. And how do we better connect the dots in terms of our bureaucracies, in terms of our alliances, in terms of our multilateral association? So there are several questions that go under that one, but I want to throw that out to you. How do we do it?
Well, I think one way that helps internationally and at home is to understand that there's a global women's movement. It is not, and I'm delighted and proud of the United States part in it, believe me, but it is not, feminism is not a US issue. It wasn't invented here. It's not a global North issue. On the contrary, leadership more and more has come from the global South who know what they're doing. And it is our job in the global North to listen and work with that. You were mentioning the pattern of ethnic bigotry in the world at large, of religious fundamentalism, of violent rhetoric and violent acts. I could add in there the international arms trade and so forth. What happens when we look at home, where we find more and more ethnic bigotry, religious fundamentalism? I call it the US Taliban, the Friends of the Fetus, the bombers of abortion clinics, the violent rhetoric and even acts, and we don't even have a sane domestic policy on guns. I realize I'm in Texas, but probably the most progressive people in Texas are in this room, which makes me nervous. They could drop a net over all of you, and that would. But it is true. We have to look to our own house and not position ourselves as the beacon of the world, even in those rare occasions where we are, and I'm proud of those, and approach the international community with the kind of humility that has been discussed before in rhetoric, but never really practiced, with what I would call feminist diplomacy. Because in fact, women around the world are in the same boat. That does not mean that women in the US who suffer bias, particularly European American women, are in the same boat with the woman in Afghanistan or in Iraq. But it does mean that the settings and the costumes and the dialogue may differ in extreme, but the plot is exactly the same. And when we realize we're in the same boat, that female genital mutilation was practiced in the United States up into the 1940s as a cure for lesbianism and masturbation, then suddenly we're not Lady Bountiful pointing at, quote, savages in some other place. It's a matter of doing our homework. It's a matter of approaching the global women's community, and then beyond that, with humility and respect, and listening to women ourselves, and starting at home. That's one way.
Could I just follow in on that? I've spent quite a bit of time in the field in Afghanistan and Yemen, and I also do, reputation management as well. And one of my observations over the years is that if you want to have credibility, you have to have credibility. And you have to be seen to have credibility. And a key component of credibility is humility and the ability to listen. And one of the issues that used to confront me when I worked in Yemen and Afghanistan is my staff would come up to me and say, "We thought you were better than we were, but here you are firing people without cause. You're harassing your female staff. Your female contractors are being fired without cause because they're pushing gender too much. It's making their male colleagues uncomfortable. So where is your credibility? How can you actually tell us about what democracy is, what human rights are, when we see you abusing the human rights of your own staff?" And I think that's really, really important. If you want to be a leader, you actually have to be better than everyone else. And the US, for many decades, was that kind of leader. But in order to maintain that leadership, you have to maintain vigilance and constantly be keeping your own house in order. And creating the kind of sanctions, benchmarks, indicators, hard targets that are necessary to establish accountability.
Thank you.
In terms of the how, what do we do?
Yeah.
I very much agree with my colleagues, and probably the most important effective thing that can be done to advance feminist foreign policy is something that may not sound like foreign policy, but it is giving space and voice to women's movements and enabling them to thrive. The US has a very important role to play in protesting the abuse of women human rights defenders who are coming under enormous attack in places like Afghanistan, and Seema Samar is one, and will be talking to us about that. But in terms of funding and things like that, there is this unfortunate problem which comes from the US's loss of credibility on human rights in general, which is that this problem of feminism being seen as a Western concern, which it absolutely is not. But when the US supports women's movements around the world, that can actually lead to their loss of credibility. So the question is, what kind of funding processes would help to foster an enriching of women's collective action around the world? And the reason this is so important is if we think back to what Valerie said earlier, in countries where there's high gender equality and low violence against women, there is a lesser resort to conflict or none. They are more stable. Now, what leads to countries having high gender equality and low violence against women? There is one thing that has been found universally to lead to those two good things, which is strong, vocal women's movements, engaged in public decision making. So this is a really key part of social transformation. And there's a very interesting funding experiment being run right now by the Dutch government, which is to support women's collective action in North Africa and the Middle East by funding women's organizations, but not by funding women's organizations' projects, because the entire funding world works on projects that people have to be accountable for outcomes, but rather funding women's organizations' development as organizations, paying for a financial officer, the purchase of computers, the development of internal systems, enabling them to be organizations and to develop constituencies. And after they are funded to do this, PricewaterhouseCoopers steps in and does an audit, which is gold, because if you pass that audit, you can then apply for funding anywhere you have credibility as an organization. So that's an interesting approach. Domestic feminism is strong in many countries that should be part of a global alliance on women's rights, like South Africa, Brazil, India. Domestic feminism in India probably has the biggest women's movement in the world in terms of numbers. It's strong, but it's not influencing foreign policy, and arguably that's the case at times in American history too. to say the least. Then there's a question of supporting actually democratization in these countries in order to enable more of a feminist voice in foreign policy and make international decision-making more transparent. And just another thing in terms of the concrete how. This was alluded to in Lauren Wolf's comments. It is striking to people like me and many here that we know that sexual violence is going to happen in almost every conflict. We know that domestic violence goes up exponentially in many conflicts. And yet we don't anticipate this problem as part of humanitarian work and foreign aid, and we don't set in place systems to deal with it. That's really strange. We know that refugees need food and shelter. We know that they need asylum procedures set in place, and we automatically set those up. Not adequately for sure, but they are set up in places where their conflict happens. Why don't we do these things on gender? We know that if women have control over land, they will increase agricultural production. So starting to incorporate this knowledge into the reflex of foreign aid and foreign affairs is crucial. And that is my question to all of you. Why doesn't that happen? Because we know it. You all know it. And the State Department knows it, and USAID knows it.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we open it up to the floor? We have a few minutes for Q&A. Any questions? Great.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I'm a sophomore at Texas A&M. My question is, what are your views on abortion? Shouldn't women have a say in what can be done with their bodies?
In terms of a foreign policy perspective, are you asking?
I suppose that is more of a domestic question. My apologies. But it can be seen as a foreign policy issue as well, I suppose.
Well, maybe if we could, because it might bridge other questions that might be out there. Might you also be interested in terms of a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, women's health, including women's reproductive health, which we've had some discussion today? I think that might be kind of
a better question.
Better to lead us to the where do we go from here?
Yes.
So let's throw out the health issue, and I think Valerie made the great correlation today between health and women's inclusion. So,
well, whether the A word is a problem or not, unless and until women's right to control her own reproductive, as a basic human right, her own reproductive system, is a pillar of our foreign policy and our domestic policy as well. Women cannot be, full human beings and with their full agency over their lives. This has been a political football of our foreign policy, back and forth, depending on different administrations. Funding for, funding against, no funding, can't mention it abroad, and this has got to stop. It is simply a basic human right, and that's all that there should be to it, and nothing more needs to be said. And the Vatican Islamist coalition that seems to have forgotten the Crusades, because it's more important to stop women from controlling their own reproduction, has to be swept aside, and this has to stop being a political football at home so that it isn't one abroad, period. Okay.
Well, of course, this is a trigger issue. Maybe I shouldn't use the word trigger when we're talking about conflict.
Guns. And guns.
And guns. And it is the reason why U.S. foreign policy on women's rights is not stronger. Because in domestic policy, in U.S. domestic policy, there is such a profound rift on this issue. We could go on and on about this, and the Helms Amendment has, of course, shaped U.S. foreign policy in profound ways and limited women's rights in many ways for a long time on this issue. I would say, once again, talk to the women who are in conflict zones. What do they need? What do they want? If you're in Congo and you're in a rape crisis center, there are very few for a start. But a young 14-year-old girl I met came in once pregnant with a hole in her side from a wound and a baby on the other side. And she did say, do I have to have this rapist baby? There is a line in Resolution 2122 of the UN Security Council, which is extremely interesting. It's in the a preambular paragraph. It says, Anybody who has been made a victim of war has the right to medical treatment without discrimination, and this is in the Geneva Conventions. It's part of foundational humanitarian aid and law. Everybody has the right, soldier or civilian, to medical treatment without discrimination. Now, if we take the term without discrimination to really mean without discrimination, it means we can't discriminate between the medical needs of women and men. And women have different medical needs than men do. And especially somebody coming in who's been raped needs antiretrovirals right away and a chance to decide what to do about a potential pregnancy.
And I'd like to weigh in on another issue about that the denial of contraception and safe abortion is a violation of women's human rights. We have examples, for example, in Honduras, in Guatemala and El Salvador, where it's illegal for a woman to have an abortion, even if she has an ectopic pregnancy. So in a situation where a woman has no chance of surviving, her child has no chance of surviving, she can still not obtain an abortion. So what is that? Is that state-sanctioned murder? I would suggest that it is. And so, the issue of access to contraception and safe abortion, in my opinion, is critical to the development, critical to peace and security, critical to human development. I've also worked in many nations, as my co-panelists have, where I've met women who've had 10, 12 children, and they've gone insane, because of the combination of I met one woman who had 12 children, and 9 of them had died, and she was effectively a prisoner of her own body. She had no access to birth control, and yet, down the road, there was another aid agency dispensing Viagra for men. This was, I won't tell where, I won't say where this was, but that was considered a critical sort of health need in that area, and yet women weren't getting contraception.
And I would like, if I could, having covered some of these issues for some years, and particularly in the context of Afghanistan, I think there's some issues that are very connected to women's health and the health of girls, and that are connected to practices that are allowed by tradition or excused to culture or to the lack of legal implementation. And I want to mention the problem that has broken my heart for 13 years when I've worked on, with Afghan women, and that is the issue of forced and child marriages. I believe, according to UNICEF, 60% of the young women in Afghanistan are under the age of 16 when they are married. There are 8-year-old girls who are forcibly married to 40, 50, 60-year-old men. I think it should be part of the red line for all of us working together. It's an issue I feel strongly about, and if you look at early marriages of girls, we've talked about women today, but there are girls here who I think are pretty voiceless. And the problem of obstetric fistula, which occurs when a very young girl bears a child. It's a horrible problem. The clinics are full. There's not enough help. So I think the question was a good one, but it's very complicated, and there are a lot of different challenges involved. Do we have time for one more, Valerie, or would you like us to wrap up?
I was actually going to ask a question.
Oh, good. I thought maybe you were giving me
Alyssa, this is for you. I've heard the panelists talk about democratization, and I'd like to challenge you. It certainly seems to me, on the basis of what we saw in the Arab uprising, that democracy has been bad for women, and that, in fact, some of the best regimes for women have been long-standing autocrats who, towards the end of their lives, have finally realized that women are people and they should do something for them. And the second question I'd like to ask is, even though a couple of you have mentioned how our alliance structures would change if we took the cause of women seriously, give me an example. Who would you drop as an ally, and what would the consequences be? Thank you.
Who would we have as allies? Who would you draw as? Who would you drop as allies?
Who would we drop or draw? drop.
Drop, right. Probably our only allies would be the Scandinavians and, but that's my first thought. My second is a realization it would be the Scandinavians and all the villages at village level around the world, where the women who are maybe non-literate, who are supposedly non-powerful, who are supposedly just women reside. They would understand, and that's a very powerful set of allies. I don't know yet, since I'm just making that discovery of linking that with Scandinavians, how that gets organized. But those would be the extremes, and probably not so many in the middle, whether they had oil or not.
Okay.
Anne-Marie?
Okay, so let me start with the point on alliances, which is a terribly difficult one because the realpolitik requires alliances with energy suppliers, with arms purchasers, and geostrategically located nations that will host military bases, U.S. military bases. There's no question that this is an enormously difficult question and requires trade-offs, but there's a lot of creative work that can be done there. First, though, let me say the U.S. has really interesting alliances in the UN, or at least potential allies that I don't feel are being cultivated enough on this issue. The big voices in women's rights debates this year and last year were small and not very powerful countries. Uruguay, the Philippines, South Korea, and then also middle-sized countries that are enormously interesting. Chile, Argentina, Brazil. And there's many, many more. Most of the Central American countries, well, actually not, they're complicated because of Catholicism, but there are some very interesting allies, sometimes Turkey. So beyond the Scandinavians and the obvious Europeans, a lot more can be done to work with those countries to develop an explicit, shared commitment to work together on these issues. Now, of course, when the U.S. comes forward with women's rights, it immediately becomes a red flag and a trigger for the opposition. But the U.S. can work behind these countries in these debates and have them come forward with propositions that the U.S. uses its enormous power to support. So there's constructive and new alliances that are possible. I have to run, I'm out of time. Democracies, complicated question. I'm glad you brought it up, but I'm being told that time is out. But just to say very briefly, women would have done much better in the Arab Spring if the world had been supporting democratic development there for much longer, yes, and supporting women's capacity to mobilize politically and develop political constituencies so that they didn't collapse the minute elections came and the Muslim Brotherhood with their electoral machines moved in. Women need electoral machines too.
Thank you. Bravo. And could I just add something? Historically, what we've seen with revolutions is that they're typically followed by terror. So whenever there's a power vacuum, it's going to be filled by the most extreme elements. The Bolshevik Revolution was followed by terror. The French Revolution could go on and on and on. So I think, in terms of foreign policy, the United States and its allies have to be very wary of supporting revolutions because there are unintended consequences which can actually be far worse than the original despot or tyranny that precedes it. And I would say, and it's something that Valerie and I mention in our book, that in the world of sort of realpolitik feminism, it is probably wiser to support the secular devil that you know than the non-secular extremist devil that you don't. Yes. Because at least in a secular society, there will be change. There is education. Women will be educated. People can sit in their cafes and talk for the most part. And we've seen, of course, with the Ba'athist regime under Saddam Hussein, women had enjoyed tremendously more rights than they do now. Similarly in Egypt under Mubarak. So I think it behooves the United States and its allies to be very, very careful in the future and not to be too quick to support rebellions, particularly when they're Islamic in nature, or when the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. I think we have to choose our allies very carefully and figure out who will actually represent the process of democratization in the long run. And when I mean democratization, I mean the inclusive security, observing and honoring the rights of all people.
Thank you. And if I can wrap up with maybe an observation as a former diplomat, a former person who had worked at the State Department and on international women's issues, I used to find that how we make the case is just as important as who do we make it to. And if we look at potential new alliances, I think we have to do a better job making the case about why standing up for the cause of women and girls is not certainly a soft thing. Please get rid of that phrase. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And you make that case, and I have, with men from other countries across the desk when you say, here's the win-win, and this is why this will be the smart thing for you to do for your country. In Afghanistan, men have seen that when their wives, their daughters get jobs, the bottom line improves for them too. And I think Michèle made this point very well this morning. What works? What's going to make the whole thing more effective? And what are the better results you're going to see? And so get off the moral, we know what's right because it's right, but what is smart because it's smart? And my concluding remark would be, and I think often of this proverb, it's an African proverb, and it's something along the lines of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So let's find ways we can go together, build that common ground, and frankly, when I look at the road ahead, and as we look at the challenges ahead, I think we couldn't have any better traveling companions than the wonderful people we have with us here in this panel and here in this audience today. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll now break for lunch. We're pleased to tell you that we have sandwiches and drinks and chips for you in room 1101. The student ambassadors from the Bush School will point you in the direction of lunch and then come back in a short half hour so that we can reconvene. Thank you.